All right, before we move on to Wilson's 14 points, I want to talk about women's war efforts a little bit. When the United States entered the Great War, employment opportunities for women rapidly spread. In 1890, 14.8% of women were in the regular workforce. By the end of the war, 47.2% of women worked outside of the home. And they use slogans such as "free a man to fight." They had semi-skilled operatives in manufacturing. They worked as stenographers, which were shorthand reporters. They worked as typists, bookkeepers. They were almost in every field that men had widely occupied. Um, in manufacturing, they produced bombs, grenades, firearms, ammunition, wristwatch, clocks, ID tags, eating utensils, optical goods. They worked with drug preparations. They made pistol holders. Almost every item that a man would use to fight in the war, women helped make. Um, Newspaper and suffragist magazines encouraged women to support the war work and to serve their country, not themselves. So women did all kinds of things. They planted $350 million worth of food in 1917. Suffragists sold $1 million worth of Liberty bonds. And it was said that no modern war can succeed without its women war assets. For example, one of the women that I came across in my personal studies, her name was Helen C. Bulvosky, and that's Bulovski. She was only 5 feet tall and weighed only 100 pounds. She completed her high school education in 1914 and she graduated as a nurse in 1917, the same year that Wilson declared the United States would enter the Great War. She recorded her experience as a non-combat military nurse before she left, and she referred to Belgium as the God-forsaken hollow of Belgium. She found herself on the front lines when her medical team was sent to the ruins of a hotel in France. Now, typically, female nurses were kept way behind the front lines, and they were not permitted at the field hospitals. But the attending head surgeon had permitted those nurses that she was with to stay since they were ready to work and the hospital needed help. But what happened to her was those front lines moved, and her experience led her to witness the horrors of the and the shock of what happened as those men came straight in. Now, one of the things that we just kind of quickly talked about in the last one was the idea of trench warfare. Trench warfare was somewhat new. It was a new concept. So prior, if you look at, say, the Civil War and the wars leading up to that, the men had marched in straight lines and just kind of shot at one another, and that's kind of what the trenches did, except the trenches they dug in and they were in the ground across from each other. This is one downfall of the online classes. I can't figure out how to kind of show you how these lines were. But so it's kind of World War One was an old type of fighting style combined with new technologies that cause a lot more destruction for individuals. You can see in this photo here the women and men with the gas masks. So you have more accurate artillery. You have gases that really produce more challenges. So Blavatsky being there kind of on the front lines of this hospital, there was one night she said she often found herself among blood-stained clothing, nursing open wounds, watching men come in who were basically starving, and just the mass amounts of death that she saw. At first, she felt like the life had been sucked out of her. But as time went on, she said that women, and this is a quote from her, lost our frail dispositions and developed into husk gypsies who were ready to move in short notice. She herself faced a lot of challenges of such as a lack of winter clothes, lack of food and water, lack of sleep, and was often under fire from airstrike. Another woman was Catherine Stimson, and she was very much discouraged from her family to become a physician, even though it was the path of many in her family. But being a male, it was not permissible for her to be a doctor by her parents. So she was never able to become a physician, but her contributions to the medical field and the Army are undeniable. She graduated from graduate school with a degree in nursing in 1908. She was incredibly active in reforming children's hospitals in St. Louis. But she left her post there in 1917 and enlisted in the Army Nurses Corps. And there she worked as the head nurse for the base hospital 21. The hospital was composed of about 55 nurses, and she departed 5 weeks after the U.S. declared war with in World War I. She served with the British Expeditionary Forces, and by 1918 she was the chief nurse of the Red Cross. And that was due to her amazing organizational and leadership abilities. By the end of the Great War, Stimson was actually awarded the United States Distinguished Service Medal and received numerous medals from the French and British governments. And in 1919, she was appointed the first dean of the Army School of Nursing. So women, you can see, found ways even to serve overseas during the war. Teddy Roosevelt actually wrote he warned his daughters-in-law that they were not to do anything foolish like following their husbands into the Great War. And Teddy Roosevelt's son, Theodore Roosevelt Jr., he enlisted in the war, and Eleanor, now do not get this confused with future First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt. This is Teddy Roosevelt's daughter-in-law, Eleanor Butler Alexander Roosevelt, who was married to Teddy Jr. But now she snuck out of the house, and ended up going with the YMCA, and she was in Europe for the majority of the war. July 24th, 1917, she set sail with the UMCA, or the YMCA's group, as a soldier's wife, and volunteered her services overseas. Teddy Roosevelt's exact quote was that no women in the family were to follow their husbands to France. But once on the other side of the Atlantic, Mrs. Roosevelt Jr. ran a canteen. She taught elementary French. One of her pupils was Sergeant George E. Adamson's, which was General Pershing's secretary. She was also actually asked to design the uniform for the YMCA Women's Volunteer, and she organized the volunteers and events. Teddy Roosevelt ended up being very proud of his daughter-in-law's service to her country, even though he was not initially impressed with her leaving the States. He said in a letter to her, "I hear of you continually. I doubt if I have ever known such a hearty and universal commendation being expressed for difficult work of a kind." And President Roosevelt ended up becoming one of the biggest supporters of women's suffrage, due in part to his daughter-in-law's service to the United States. So women had a great role that they played in World War I, and So the YMCA, now we think of it as being a community service, but it was much more than that. They were there to help with the morale and the well-being of the soldiers. They created recreational activities, rest and relaxation for battle-weary soldiers, sailors, and Marines. They operated canteens, the overseas exchanges, and actually Teddy Roosevelt Jr. ended up being wounded in battle, and he wanted his wife to be the one to nurse him back to health. So they got him to her while he was, while he was there. So World War One had devastating effects, and it changed a lot of people. Europe was devastated out of the events, and but it certainly changed women's roles in society from what we had seen them before.